Because of the intermittent nature of wind, we hear a lot about no problem, we just store the energy. And in this little episode, I explain how ridiculous those claims are, because nobody is doing the maths. So the first question is, how much storage is needed to balance wind? As explained in previous episodes in this series, Britain in 2018 went 9 days without any wind power at all. This video is concerned with how you use storage, or fail to use storage, to back up that wind when it fails. In this video, I'll first assume that all the baseload, about 26 gigawatts, is taken care of by things like nuclear or maybe some coal. So first, let us look at the variable amount that we have to provide throughout the day to cope with a varying demand. This is meant to be supplied by wind. So in this example, the wind is supplying a total of 185 gigawatt hours. So to store the energy needed for 9 days without wind, we would need 9 times 185 gigawatt hours, which is 1665 gigawatt hours. But let's allow for the solar that would have contributed in those 9 days, and that's about 18 gigawatt hours a day. So we'll take that off, which is 162 gigawatt hours, and we end up with 1665 minus 162 equals 1503 gigawatt hours of storage needed. Let's round that off to 1500 gigawatt hours. This 9 days is, of course, not the worst scenario. Just having very low wind for a continued period of weeks could be much worse. But to make life simple, we'll just do the 9 days to show you the extent of the problem. We have assumed in all the figures to date that the base load is taken care of by nuclear power, coal or other base load means. You cannot use nuclear, coal and such to balance wind. Such sources cannot be manipulated fast enough to cope with the variations in the wind. Gas reigns supreme for that, but you can use gas for baseload. Whilst you can't use nuclear to vary the load quickly, you can use gas for any purpose, for varying load quickly or for baseload. And the amazing thing is that this government, as predecessor governments have actually done away with our baseload. They've actually done away with nuclear and coal. So the figures I've given you so far are simply incorrect. The picture is much, much worse than I've painted. I had assumed that the baseload of 26 kilowatts had been taken care of, but when you come to examine the figures, you find this is not the case at all. The fact is they've used wind for everything, and that means the situation and the amount of storage you need for wind when it stops is much, much greater than I've told you so far. I have taken the last annual UK energy brief from the government for the following figures. This government and previous governments have allowed our nuclear power to decline from over 12 gigawatts down to 4.5 today and heading for under 2 gigawatts. Just taking a typical recent day where we look at what power's been supplied from what source and look at the night time here, you can see that the only real baseload powers are nuclear at 4.5 gigawatts and biomass, the one we subsidise with Drax Power Station to almost £1 billion a year, that one at about 3.5, so a total of about 8 gigawatts, not 26. So we are short by 18 gigawatts, and the rest is made up of wind and gas. Now, if we go back on the same graph to just 24 hours, you can see that the wind had died down and the gas had to be increased. So we're using wind and gas as the baseload. The big takeaway from this now is, first of all, we have to almost quadruple the amount of storage needed to cover that 9 days without wind power. So in effect, the whole policy with wind has made our economy, our total power generation, much more dependable on gas than it ever has been, which is why we're being hit now so hard by the gas price. So how do we balance the wind now? Well, we use the highly controllable gas. So as you can see from this graph, as the wind power fails, gas has to step in. This world is so full of deceit, and we first have to unscramble some of the hype you're being fed. And we'll start with just looking at wind farms and the claims of how many houses they manage to supply with power. This one will do 500,000, that one will do 32,000, and so on. But just look at the facts here. The official government figures for per day consumption for a home in the UK are, for electricity, 10.22 kilowatt hours a day, and for gas, 32.87 kilowatt hours a day. So the total consumption of those in kilowatt hours is 43 kilowatt hours per home per day. By way of example, we're going to take the world's largest wind turbine. This 12 megawatt offshore turbine from General Electric has the potential to generate 67 gigawatt hours of wind power each year. Notice the word potential there, and that they claim is enough to power around 16,000 homes. So let's examine these figures and that turbine. First of all, this turbine is absolutely gigantic, many times bigger than Big Ben. In fact, you could fit a couple of Big Bens into each blade. This structure, together with foundations in concrete, etc., is absolutely enormous. So what sort of energy do we get out of such a marvellous piece of engineering, such a huge expenditure? And by the way, all built using fossil fuels, of course, because the amount of fossil fuels required and the amount of CO2 produced in the manufacture and installation of these is absolutely enormous. So they can't obviously be built for any particular climate emergency, because you'd never get the CO2 back. But anyway, let's carry on and examine the amount of energy we get out of them. The output at peak, when the wind is perfect, of course, is 12 megawatts, which is 12,000 kilowatts. The claim is 16,000 homes, so it can power just 0.75 of a kilowatt for each home. That's 3/4 of a kilowatt, not even enough to operate a 1-bar electric fire, and cannot match the demand as you cook an evening meal, which can often use 3, 4 or 5 kilowatts. And of course, when the wind is not fully blowing, you get less, and when it's not blowing at all, it powers no homes. The turbine claims 67 gigawatt hours per year. That's when positioned in the perfect place in the North Sea. That is about a 64% of its rated maximum capacity, which is more than double the normal 30% effective capacity of UK wind farms, and we'll show you that in a graph later in this video. So 67 over 365 days is 183,000 kilowatt hours per day. With each house at 43 kilowatt hours, then you get 4,255 homes, not the 16,000. However, only about 2,000 homes if you take the normal UK performance for wind farms at 30% of rated capacity. But of course, our power grid plans totally ignore the new need for extra power for EV charging, as well as, of course, as never being able to reliably offer you the power when you need it most. And of course, totally reliant on gas, which has to have a matching capacity built for when the wind is not blowing. Otherwise, we have to pay up to 50 times the normal price to import energy, as we did recently in 2022. And of course, overnight, when the demand is not there from those 4,000 homes, they still have to pay to give the energy away or to shut down the turbines. You pay when you do not even want to use the energy. And we should not forget the environmental damage caused by wind farms, where they kill the birds, kill the flying insects, and kill hundreds of thousands of bats. This is the sort of misleading headline I've become used to. The UK being supplied at 50% of its power by wind. What they don't point out is it's only for a tiny amount of time, of course. So look at a typical month like this last May. Well, there is what they would have you believe, 50% of our total generation being supplied by wind. But in actual fact, this is the truth. So this, in the month of May, is an example of the truth. This is how the wind power output varies. It's up to 50% of the total power as supplied sometimes, and down to almost zero at other times, as you can see. And this is the same graph for the whole of the year of 2021. And as you can see, it is not a reliable power source. This 34-year study of UK wind farm output is really interesting. It shows how much of the claim capacity you actually get. It varies throughout the year, as you can see, at times as high as 40% of what they claim, and at times as low as 20%. But don't forget, these are monthly figures, and in the month, it often goes to zero. So overall, they're claiming an average of 30%. But as we know, with those 3 Scottish farms that were investigated by MPs, they found that almost 50% of the time we were paying them not to produce the wind because we couldn't use it overnight when demand was low. Therefore, the real figure can be as low as 15%. And that, of course, just in that one factor, doubles the costs. We're now approaching almost £1 billion. That is 1,000 million pounds. For wind farms not to produce the wind. And on the other hand, as in the recent hot days in the UK here, we are paying 5,000% more than normal to import the energy to replace the wind. Now, having defined the problem just for the 9 days of 5,400 gigawatt hours needed, let's look at some of the solutions to storing this energy. Pump storage is a great way to store energy. You simply pump water up to the top reservoir when there's low demand and you've got spare energy, and bring it down again for peak demand. It can be applied very fast, in fact within seconds. So it is an excellent method of storage. So let's do the maths. Well, with Norwich storing 9.1 gigawatt hours and requiring 5,400 gigawatt hours just to balance the 9 days, 593 Norwichs just to store the energy required to get through those 9 days. And of course, because of the 25% energy loss, you'd have to put back in 7,200 gigawatt hours just to restore the energy you'd taken out. So now let's take a look at the biggest pump storage scheme that's proposed, not built yet, but proposed. The Corrie Glass pump storage system is a proposed system in Scotland, and it certainly is large. In fact, much larger than Norwich, and stores 30 gigawatt hours of electricity, not the 9.1 gigawatt hours of Norwich. So it's more than 3 times bigger. The press release. Corrie Glass is a proposed pumped hydro storage scheme with a potential capacity of up to 1,500 megawatts. Well, can I just say at that point, that is not capacity. That's a rate of output. That's how fast it can output. It's not capacity. It is the first large-scale pump storage scheme to be developed in the UK for more than 30 years, and would more than double Great Britain's existing electricity storage capacity. And I agree, I think it is even a good scheme. But the problem is that it stores just 30 gigawatt hours, as opposed to Norwich's 9.1 gigawatt hours of power. I can only output them at 1.5 gigawatts. So let us just look at the hype you have had on projects such as this. Powering 3 million homes with Scotland's largest ever hydro project. Wow, 3 million homes, and it's outputting 1.5 gigawatts. Let's just look at that. Hence, on that basis, it's only possible to power around about 700,000 homes for one day, not the 3 million for days. But in fairness, the project could power 3 million homes for a day if those homes also had gas, and, of course, still not days as claimed, but just a single day. But even with Corrie Glass and Norwich combined, you're only looking at an output rate of around about 3.2 gigawatts. That's the rate of output. And then, of course, you have to put back in to the storage systems about a third more than you take out. And where are you going to get this power from? Because with wind, as you can see here, when it drops, no matter how many wind vanes you can have a situation where it drops in the entire country, and there's no way you can get the extra power to begin to charge. Yes, with trebling the amount of wind, you can get extra power at the peaks to put in, only when it chooses to give it to you. And when you run the simulations on this, the whole thing is simply not viable. Pump storage was never meant to replace wholesale drops in supply. They simply do not have the capacity to do that. They were meant to, within seconds, even out the small fluctuations where demand quickly rose for a matter of minutes. That is why Norwich was built in the 1970s. Now let's take a look at batteries, battery farms, to store the energy. That when the wind goes low, we store the energy in batteries and then take it out. This one is ridiculous. Unlike pump storage, which does have a big role, a significant role in helping to balance the grid, and that happened normally. Norfolk was built in the 70s. Here, batteries are simply not feasible, and I'm going to explain why. Why not take the largest battery storage bank in the world? It's the Vistra Moss Landing Energy Storage Facility in California. This can store 1.6 gigawatt hours of energy. But we, in our example, are looking for 5,400 gigawatt hours. And it can output at a rate of 0.4 gigawatts, 0.4 gigawatts. So at its maximum output rate of 0.4 gigawatts, it can last for 4 hours. This is not a solution for huge drops in wind power. We can have a drop in wind power of 14, 15, 16 gigawatts, no issue at all, and very suddenly. This can only supply 0.4 at that rate and only last for 4 hours. And you would need an awful lot of them to even begin to approach the problem. So the world's largest battery farm stores just 1.6 gigawatt hours of energy. But we're looking for 5,400 hours of gigawatts energy to take out. And we need an enormous amount of these, and the costs are in the many, many trillions. And by the way, they have to be replaced. Batteries do not last all that long, and not only lose capacity over time, but have to be replaced, maybe a number of times in the life of a pump storage scheme. But there are not enough resources in the world to actually build all these battery banks for the Western world, or for that matter, to replace the world's internal combustion engine cars with electric ones. Nobody is doing the maths. Of course, Scotland won't be left behind in this, and they're building the same size battery bank as the one in California, 1.6 gigawatt hours. Of course, there are always new battery inventions on the way. I mean, the sand battery, for example, is often quoted. Let's look quickly at some of the facts here. The current sand battery system can discharge a maximum of just 100 kilowatts of heat power, but it has a total energy capacity of 8 megawatt hours. So it says it can last for 80 hours storage duration. But now the authorities want to make one 1,000 times bigger, or 8 gigawatts. So, with a 100 kilowatt maximum output rate, and we make it 1,000 times bigger, we're outputting 100,000 kilowatts, which is 1/10 of a megawatt. So you would need about 10,000 of these batteries to give out 1 gigawatt. Huge land use, and they're even beginning to get near to the solution. Hydrogen. The problem is its manufacture. It takes about 50 kilowatt hours to make 1 kilogram of hydrogen, and 1 kilogram of hydrogen in a fuel cell produces 16 kilowatt hours of power from that fuel cell. So you get around 1/3 of the energy you put in out. So in this example, you'd need about 18,000 gigawatt hours of energy to put in. This cost of producing hydrogen, plus its extra cost in distributing, storing and so on, ensures it is not a viable option for balancing wind power. It's as simple as that. The sums do not add up. The scale of the storage needed to cope with the abolishing of gas is such that there is no possible viable system in existence today or on the horizon that can cope with the intermittent nature of wind. Nor can you rely on just importing the energy from Europe, because a lot of the European countries, in fact most of them, have followed the madness of our own government and done away with baseload power. And so the option of just buying in when we want to is becoming untenable, even if we pay 50 times the normal price. With baseload power from nuclear and biomass standing at just 8 gigawatts without wind and imported power, we would need a supply rated at about 32 gigawatts per hour to meet our 40 gigawatt need. Wind fails constantly, and we can no longer rely on importing power when we need it. We totally rely on gas to level as never before. Without gas, we do not have enough existing or planned storage to run the UK grid for 1 minute, let alone even a day. A grid failure would take weeks for the system to boot up again to normal. Governments are like a rabbit that's been caught in the headlights of a really stupid policy called net zero. And that policy, whether they like it or not, will have to be abandoned. As I make this video today, the new Conservative government have done away with fracking. I cannot believe how stupid these people are. Whilst producing this video, it did remind me of something that happened in my early career as a water resource engineer. I was water resource engineer for Cornwall, and we had to cooperate with Somerset and Devon, Devon being the bigger authority. So we all met in Devon, where they presented us with 20 man-years of work. And I looked at this work with a big table of engineers around me and pointed out the average flow in over time was smaller than the average flow out. That's impossible. When I pointed this out to them, that all the calculations were wrong with the 20 man-years work, their comment was, that's an interesting point of view. The result was they ditched the 20 man-years of work. And really that is the story of my life. And it's a bit similar now. The problem of storage with wind is not just challenging, not just difficult, not even just demanding. It's actually impossible. In the practical world we live in, not possible. To sum up the situation, I can find no better words than those of Charles Mackay in 1841. The madness of crowds. We find the whole community suddenly fix their minds upon one object and go mad in its pursuit, that millions of people become simultaneously impressed. That, in a nutshell, is the madness of net zero. The alarmists can carry on in their wonderful, pretty world, which was so beautiful and where the fairies can play. But in actual fact, it's not a real world, and the reality of life will bring them back to the base, and net zero will have to be abandoned.